So 7 years ago, I arrived on the sunny shores of California with $100 to my name and big expectations. I had come for the sunshine, for the perfectly ripe avocados, and of course, the cute boys who would be waiting for me everywhere, and all I'd have to do is point to one and say, "You, there in the plaid. We're together now." I'd also begin my quest for inner peace in California by practicing yoga and meditation with other folks who were interested in enlightenment. Together, we would raise the vibration of the planet with our spiritual powers, group hugs, and intense but loving eye contact. It would be beautiful. And I started dreaming about California when I was 13 years old. Back then, I was living a very different life in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Cleveland with my 2 brothers and my parents. And the apartment was so run down, it was basically like living in an abandoned building, that you could see the basement through the floorboards. And it was infested with roaches and mice, which meant that sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to a roach crawling across my face, or even worse, in my ear. And I still have nightmares about that place. And when I was a kid, my brothers and I would always ask each other questions like, what you think you're gonna be when you grow up? And if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you wanna live? Because we really wanted to leave that apartment and that neighborhood. And we would ask each other those questions with all the hope and innocence of youth. We didn't understand the depth of our circumstances, that we had been born into a cycle of oppression and poverty so pervasive that in generations of my family, very few had escaped. Our ancestors had been sharecroppers, my grandfather, and before that, slaves, my great-great-great-grandmother. And we, their descendants, had inherited circumstances that we couldn't possibly understand or process. We thought that the violence and the drug use that we saw from our parents and the other adults around us was normal. That it was normal to see somebody being beaten or stabbed or so addicted to crack that they'd crawl around on the floor for hours chasing the white ghost, which is a slang term that means looking for crack rocks that might have fallen on the floor. And so when my brothers would ask me those questions, I would always say the same thing. I'm moving to California, where it's warm all year round and you can wear sandals and flip-flops all year, just like they do in Full House. And it was Full House that first introduced me to the paradise of California and Uncle Jesse. And I know that I am not alone in my crush on Uncle Jesse. I know that there are many of you out there in this room who would melt every single time he'd have those heartfelt conversations with DJ or Stephanie, and he'd put his arm around them, and he'd say something like, "You know, DJ, in life, there's gonna be disappointments, but you'll always have your family." I know you too would melt. And if California was Uncle Jesse for me, it was also Tupac Shakur. I thought Tupac was so beautiful. I loved his music videos, which showed Black people dancing and having fun in California, but also detailed the struggles of Black America. I could sing all of his songs, but my favorite song was Keep Your Head Up, because I really needed somebody to tell me to keep my head up given my circumstances. So you see, it was beautiful men and nice weather that initially drew me to California. But it would take me 12 more years to get here. And by the time I got here, Tupac would be dead, and Uncle Jesse would be on an entirely new TV show with far less charm and shorter hair. And my path to California would be crooked. There would be many stops along the way. First stop, Dartmouth College. Even though I had grown up in one of the most poverty-stricken cities in the country, I excelled at school. And just to paint you a picture of the academic landscape that I grew up in, my freshman year of high school, we started with 900 students, but we graduated 122. So for me, school was literally all that I had. I studied all the time. I didn't have any friends. I didn't go to parties. I just studied. And that discipline earned me a spot in all 14 colleges that I applied to. Yeah, you can clap or snap. That's right. And out of all the schools that I applied to, it was Dartmouth that enticed me the most. Since neither of my parents had gone to college, the way that I chose colleges was to look at the brochure and decide how happy the students looked. And let me tell you, Dartmouth's brochure, top notch. The smiling, happy, well-placed minority students. Well-placed. The white marble buildings, the beautiful fall foliage. Even the snow looked majestic in that brochure. And I had high hopes for what Dartmouth would be for me. But I had even higher hopes for what I would be at Dartmouth. I imagined walking proudly across campus, debating contemporary political and social issues with my peers. And reading books like Marcus Aurelius' Meditations and Malcolm X's autobiography. I imagine sunbathing in the middle of the campus, just like the white girls in the movies. And I would lose my virginity one night to a sweet but troubled young man who definitely needed me to save him with my love. It would be perfect. It would be the birth of my becoming. And everything that I had dealt with and experienced in Cleveland would be a thing of the past. Dartmouth in all her beauty and glory and prestige would be the promised land I had been waiting for all my life. So imagine my surprise when I heard the word nigger ring out from a speeding pickup truck past campus one day. And I want you to know that they weren't students. They probably weren't affiliated with Dartmouth in any way. But it was enough to shatter me, to take my newly burgeoning hopes of what Dartmouth would be for me, and to remind me that in America, no matter where you go or who you become, if you're Black, you will always just be a nigger to some people. And I couldn't handle somebody trying to take my promised land from me. I needed Dartmouth to be everything that it promised me it was. I needed to feel safe and supported there. So I pushed that incident out of my mind entirely, told myself I had imagined it, and kept going. But Dartmouth would keep revealing her flaws to me, her broken promises, her inability to protect and support someone like me who had risen from an industrial wasteland in the heart of America. And though Dartmouth exposed me to some of the most brilliant minds in the country and introduced me to the higher echelons of society, I had learned a critical lesson: that there are no promised lands in this world for marginalized people. Those of us that fall outside the categories of normal. Those of us that are too Black or too poor or too foreign or too queer to belong. But I couldn't bring myself to accept that just yet. I was still hopeful, and I kept searching. And my search took me all the way to New York City, where I did what all new college graduates do: try to save the world. And even though New York was never my perfect place or promised land, there's too much concrete there for that, I had big plans for my work there. My first job out of college was investigating allegations of misconduct against the New York City Police Department. I conducted hundreds of investigations and discovered just how difficult it was to prove police misconduct, even with a ton of evidence. It was a brutal introduction to the way that the world really worked. And I felt like I didn't understand anything about this world. And New York would break me in ways that I couldn't have predicted. I felt so small and invisible in this sea of intense, ambitious people, and I couldn't keep up with the pace. But what finally pushed me over the edge was a devastating apartment fire that happened to me 2 days after Christmas. And I became so lost in the world that suicide seemed like the only answer. And the only reason I didn't do it is because I couldn't do that to my mother. I knew how it would devastate her. So I tried to rebirth myself through yoga and meditation and tantra and prostrations. I would throw myself upon the good earth day after day, begging for mercy, asking for understanding of what my purpose is here. And the questions themselves would reorient me, would point me in different directions, and eventually bring me full circle back to my 13-year-old self who dreamed of California, that I might find salvation here. And when I had rebuilt myself, when I was securely in the in-between place of not wanting to die, but still not entirely sure of what I should live for, I moved to California with $100 and a renewed sense of hope. And I still remember when my friend picked me up from the airport and drove me to her apartment in Oakland. I was blown away by the beauty of the landscape. And I thought to myself how Dr. King had gotten it all wrong. The prodigious mountains were not in New Hampshire. They were in California. And I immediately sought refuge in her inhabitants. I began looking for my tribe. I went to meetups and parties. I did ecstatic dance and lost myself so totally in the music, people would ask me if I was on drugs. I did yoga on Sunday mornings at sunrise and bought organic fruit from the farmer's market for breakfast. I went for long hikes in the redwoods and listened to the wisdom of the trees. California seduced me so convincingly that I became that annoying person on Facebook that posts things like, "Oh, nothing, just another beautiful day in the land of milk and honey." Hashtag bliss. Yes, I was having a storybook love affair with California. I truly believed that I had arrived in the promised land. Until I started noticing how people seemed to be excluding me in subtle but unmistakable ways. Like being at a party and noticing how few people would engage me in conversation. And when they did, still feeling invisible because they wouldn't make eye contact or quickly moved on to the next person. Or how many people crossed the street as I approached them in my neighborhood. But the most painful exclusion that happened was from the dating arena. I came to the painful realization that as a dark-skinned Black woman in the Bay Area, my chances of finding someone that would love me were slim to none. Yet part of me thought, it must just be me. This must be me again, projecting my trauma and my low self-esteem out onto the world. So I tried to be better, more positive, more peaceful, more zen. But I kept having the same experiences. And it was only after I wrote and performed a one-woman show called Black Virgins Are Not for Hipsters. Where I talked about my dating experiences, that I realized how pervasive my experiences were amongst Black women. They would come up to me after the show to tell me how they were having similar experiences here in the Promised Land. And I came to understand the destructiveness of colorblind liberalism. It meant that some were willing to erase the reality of my lived experience as a Black person in America for their own comfort. I grew bitter at the constant attempts to erase me. And it wasn't just colorblind liberalism. I also grew contemptuous of surface spirituality, the dead prayers for unity, the hollow platitudes of all you need is love and we're all one that seemed to ring out from all the yoga and meditation studios. Seemed to ring out in a landscape rife with homelessness and racial tensions and a booming prison population. What was the purpose of all our yoga and meditating if it didn't make us agents of change? And absent that change, weren't we just stroking our own egos? So I complained, and I scolded, and I critiqued. I wanted all of you to be different, to be better, to be the people that I had imagined in my promised land. Until I realized, California, New York, Dartmouth, Cleveland, I can't change you. I can't make you see things like how I see it. And I gave up on the whole idea of a promised land. Because what I came to understand is that the promised land is not an actual place that exists on the earth. Rather, it's the pulse of possibility for what could be. It's the living vision inside each of us. It's the dream of Martin and the determination of Malcolm. It is abolitionists digging underground railroads to freedom and civil rights activists on a bridge in Selma. It is the diary of Anne Frank and Nelson Mandela's raised fist. It is Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall and give me liberty or give me death. It is Hotel Rwanda and the Arab Spring. It is African refugees swimming across the Mediterranean for a new life and white helmets pulling survivors from the wreckage. And the paradox of the promised land is that we never get to live in it. Like all of those that came before us, our sacrifice and our toil is for a world that we will never see. And we know she's coming. We can hear her breathing, but we will never cradle her in our arms. And how bittersweet to sacrifice so profoundly for a world that you will never live in. And yet, that is what is being asked of each of us at every moment of our lives. So I hope you answer the call. I hope you become an ancestor worthy of the highest praise and the highest reverence. I sure intend to be. Thank you.